Hi, I'm Annie, and normally I sing a cappella, but today I have decided to tell you a little story. After considering different potential topics, I settled on cinema history, which you may or may not be interested in, but I've just kind of always been interested in films. I love watching commentary stuff on DVDs about how they made the movie. I thought, where better to start than at the very beginning? And also, while I am telling the story, I will be applying makeup. I did a little poll about whether or not I should try the whole makeup plus storytelling YouTube genre, and 2/3 of the votes said yes. I'm going to give it a try. No guarantees it will turn out at all. Let's get into the story while I prime my face. There are a couple disputes here and there about like what's considered the very beginning of cinema. This person that I'm going to tell you about essentially created the springboard for cinema itself. He was not looking to make motion pictures insofar as entertainment or anything like that. His achievements are why we have movies today. And that person is Eadweard Muybridge. Eadweard Muybridge was born on April 9th, 1830 to parents John and Susanna Muggeridge, and his birth name was Edward James Muggeridge. He had 3 brothers. I know one was younger, but I don't know where in the line Edward fell, if he was the oldest or second or third. His father, John, was a grain and coal merchant. Oh, forgot to mention, he was born at Kingston upon Thames in Surrey, England. They lived above his father's grain shop at number 30 High Street, right by the River Thames. And when Edward was about 12 to 13, in 1843, his father, John, passed away, and his mother, Susanna, took over the family business, ran the shop. There wasn't a lot of information about Edward's childhood as far as if his father had been a very successful merchant, if they were poor, middle class. The next piece of information about Edward comes when he is 20 years old and he emigrates to the United States. And he lives in New York for a short time, and pretty much the first 10-15 years, he works primarily as a bookseller. There's record of him working for different people or in partnership with different people, or working for himself and having his own business selling books. And a short time after emigrating to the United States and living in New York, he ends up moving out west to San Francisco and continues working as a bookseller. He was sort of particular about his name, primarily his last name, and I can't say I blame him. I think I would change my name if it was Muggeridge too. So he first changed his name from Muggeridge to Muybridge, which it's not a massive improvement, but apparently he thought so as well, and changed his name a few years later to Muybridge. He went by Muybridge for about 10 years, 1865. At the age of 35, he changes it to the final form, Muybridge. And it was often misspelled as Maybridge. I don't know if this bothered him, but I would assume it had. So, while he's in San Francisco, there's all these different art galleries in the area, and photography is really starting to take off as an art form. in, you know, the 1860s. So he starts picking it up. He's got an interest in it. He doesn't take up photography as a hobby just yet, but he is still selling books, and he starts getting into selling engravings, and he learns the art of lithograph. Lithograph is where you would have either like a limestone or a metal plate, and you would draw an image on it, like the relief image, in some sort of oil or wax. Then you would treat that stone with an acidic formula, which would then kind of etch into the stone the picture around the fat or wax. And then you would treat it with some form of ink, put a paper on it, and press it, usually with some sort of bar that would press across the top of the stone and the paper so that it would be even. So then you would have the reverse image on the paper. So basically a really complicated stamp. He started doing that in San Francisco and learned how to do that and would sell lithographs. Edward's brother George visited San Francisco in 1858, but unfortunately he contracts tuberculosis and dies. 1859, the next year, their youngest brother Thomas also visits, does not die, and Edward decides he wants to sell him his business and inventory and then go back home to England and then tour Europe, like go to Belgium and all these different places that I cannot remember off the top of my head. So he writes of this intention to do so, and he sets off. He's going to go on this whirlwind tour of Europe, but first he has to get on a cross-country stagecoach from San Francisco all the way to New York, catch a ship to get back to Europe. So he does so, and they make it to Texas before tragedy strikes. There is a runaway stagecoach accident through like the panhandle area of Texas, and the driver is killed, one other passenger is killed, and then the rest of the passengers, including Edward, are severely injured. Edward was ejected from the stagecoach and smashed his head on a rock. Now, that was in July of 1860, so he sold his business on May 15th to his brother Thomas, and then in July he's in this horrible accident, and he wakes up 9 days after in Fort Smith, Arkansas. He is suffering from headaches, double vision, deafness, loss of taste and smell, and confusion. It's also said that his hair turned from brown to white in 3 days. Now remember, he's 30 years old at this point, prematurely gray, which happens, but not usually in 3 days. He's treated in Arkansas for several weeks until some of these more severe symptoms kind of dissipate, and he goes to New York to be treated by a doctor there, but he can't seem to relax because it's New York City, it's too loud, and he cannot handle the hustle and bustle of New York City while he's dealing with all of this massive head trauma. So he goes off to the countryside. Once he recovers to a satisfactory point, he goes back to New York to sue the stagecoach company, and he wins. The settlement that he receives is $2,500, which in today's money would be valued at $80,437.95. So, not bad. After winning his lawsuit, he continues with his original plan, well, part of his original plan. He goes to Kingston, he stays with his mother, and he's still recuperating. He does not, however, go on his fancy tour of Europe. While he's in England, he is treated by Sir William Gull, a famed physician of the time who was so famous that he treated Queen Victoria herself, and almost 30 years later, based on circumstantial evidence, is implicated to be Jack the Ripper. Never proven, obviously, because we still don't know for sure who Jack the Ripper was, but Sir William Gull was implicated. Edward is being treated by him, and he is advised by Sir William Gull to abstain from meat, alcohol, and coffee for a year. Edward later claimed in his life at some point that it was actually this Dr. Gull who originally encouraged Edward to take up photography. People are not really sure about this because at the time, you think photography is a relaxing hobby. Well, not back then. It was a whole process. So either way, whether it was Dr. Gull who encouraged him to do so, or whether he just got it in his head that he wanted to do it, one way or the other, he does take up photography and learns wet plate collodion process. Now, collodion is a flammable viscous solution made from nitrocellulose in ether and alcohol. He couldn't drink alcohol, but he could play with it. So, wet plate collodion process was where you would have the photographic material, like a tin type or something, and you would take the collodion and you would coat the plate and then sensitize it, expose it, which is where you have a certain exposure time, and that's why at the time you would have to expose the photograph because of the chemical on it, the collodion, and then close the shutter and develop. Now this process for wet plate collodion photography took place in about 15 minutes. But that's why at the time, everyone's all statuesque in all of these pictures and everybody looks like they are completely miserable. It's because you can't smile for 15 minutes straight, okay? It's not comfy. He takes up photography. He becomes somewhat obsessed with it. He very much enjoys it and becomes quite good at it. And in 1867, February, he returns to the United States. So he was in England for about 6.5 years, living with his mother and I think at one point his aunt, and then he returns to the United States. And when he gets there, he converts a 2-wheel carriage into a portable darkroom and starts advertising under the name Helios, which I'm fairly certain was supposed to be some kind of clever thing about photography, photo meaning light, because Helios was the Greek Titan god of the sun. Also, I believe, was a little bit of an indication of his ego. Just a little bit. So from 1867 to 1872, he did this. He took a lot of landscape photographs and also San Francisco cityscapes, and he sold them in stores on stereograph cards. Now, stereograph cards were a mirror image of the same picture, or maybe not even a mirror image, but sometimes they were reflected in a mirror. That you'd look through a stereoscope, look through the lenses at the two pictures, and it would kind of trick your eyes into merging them to make it look three-dimensional. 1868, he became world famous for his photographs of Yosemite Valley. So due to this notoriety from his photographs of Yosemite Valley, he is then commissioned for the very first time by the US government to take photographs of the landscape and the native peoples and immigrant people groups in the brand new territory of Alaska. So he travels up there and does all of that. And then in 1871, just a couple of years later, he was commissioned by the Lighthouse Board, which was some function of the government that I didn't know existed, back then. He's commissioned to photograph lighthouses, shocker, along the West Coast. And then in May of that same year, 1871, he falls in love with and marries the 21-year-old divorcee, Flora Shallcross Stone. Her maiden name was Downs. There's really not much information that I could find about Flora. I do find it interesting that she was divorced already at the age of 21. That was a taboo back then. But I don't know what the situation was with her first marriage. I do know the situation with the marriage to Edward though, and we will get into that. So, they get married, and then the next year he is hired by the former governor, at the time, former governor of California, well, still former governor, because, you know, he's dead now, but anyway, Leland Stanford hires Muybridge to take pictures of his properties. Now, Leland Stanford is an interesting dude. He, just to give you an idea of how insanely wealthy this guy was, he was said to be a robber baron, so like kind of a sketchy businessman. But his business holdings, I feel like, are insane even by today's standards. He's like the Bill Gates of his time. He was a Freemason. He started out as a merchant and wholesaler, and then after the gold rush, he went out to California, started some businesses there. He ran businesses with his brothers. He started a library association thing out in, I think, Sacramento. And then at some point he was the president of Central Pacific Railroad and then later the Southern Pacific Railroad. Also, he was president of the Occidental and Oriental Steamship Company, which ran between Japan and China and, you know, way over in Asia. He lived in California and he's got this company over there. And he is also the founder of Stanford University. Stanford is an important figure in the story of Eadweard Muybridge, but that's all I'm gonna tell you about his background, because his background isn't really important other than to illustrate how wealthy he was, because he ended up being Muybridge's patron pretty much for the rest of Stanford's life, because he did pass before Muybridge did. So back to Muybridge. Leland Stanford hires Muybridge to basically make a photographic portfolio of all of his possessions. Now, something else that he owned besides all of these giant corporations, although he didn't own all of them at this time, but something else that he owned was racehorses. And he desperately wanted a photograph of one of his horses, Occident, at full gallop. Now, you may not believe this, but this was actually a visual and artistic achievement that had never been accomplished in paintings of horses. Any artistic rendering of a horse at full gallop was not correct. So Stanford wanted this photograph. Now, he commissioned or hired Muybridge in 1872, but it's not until 1873 that Edward finally manages to capture a small, fuzzy photograph of this horse Occident at full speed. But because it was small and fuzzy, they were happy about having achieved it, period, but they knew it wasn't good enough, and it didn't satisfy Muybridge or Stanford. So they were going to keep trying. So the same year that he catches this unsatisfactory photograph of Occident at full speed, Muybridge is commissioned by the United States Army to photograph the Modoc War. Now, the Modoc War was a campaign of the United States Army for various reasons against the Modoc people of Southern Oregon and Northern California. So, Native American tribes against the U.S. Army, and you can probably fill in blanks about how that went and why and blah blah blah. Eadweard goes and takes photos of that. 1874, things kind of pick up for Eadweard. His first son is born, Florado Helios Muybridge. He and Flora welcomed their son, Florado. I assume that's how you say his name. I don't know how else you would, really. Yay! Happy news! Congratulations, guys, on your new baby. Except Eadweard and Flora were 20 years apart. And that's fine, except they had very disparate interests and temperaments. So, remember the stagecoach accident? You know, where he got that nice bump on his head and his hair turned white and he had all these symptoms. Well, part of the effect of that head trauma was that his personality changed. Flora didn't know him at that point, but he had been kind of a nice person. Pleasant, easy to get along with. Just a good businessman. After his accident, it was said, well, it was really when he came back to the United States, because he only really knew people in San Francisco before he left, and he was in New York before traveling to England. But when he came back to San Francisco 7 years after the accident, his friends and acquaintances from before said that he was a completely different person. He was prone to outbursts, and then he would act like nothing had happened. And then he was just really temperamental and like peevish. If a customer seemed the least bit dissatisfied with his work, he would actually refuse payment from them and would not sell them the work, even if they were still willing to buy it. If he sensed, even wrongly, that they didn't like what he did, that was it. So it was also said that he kind of stopped caring about his appearance. As far as I can tell, he still bathed and things like that, but he didn't take care of himself the way he had used to. And he went from this even-keeled, pleasant businessman to an erratic, emotional, eccentric artist. Do you like that alliteration? Those 3 E words? That was excellent. That's how he was, but his wife Flora was young and agreeable. She had an active social life. There's really not much said about her, but it is said that their personalities were really not similar at all. He had all these government commissions and stuff, and he's gone all the time. So he didn't mind that she had an active social life. I think he realized it'd be kind of terrible of him to expect her to just lock herself away and never do anything if he's not home, because he was never home. There's not really any evidence exactly that he necessarily mistreated her or anything, but he would be gone for months at a time. Because Eadweard is gone so much, I guess Flora was kind of hurting for some attention or something. That seemed to be the case, because she started becoming, at least emotionally, attached to a mutual friend, Major Harry Larkins. Eadweard knew this. He didn't think it was extremely serious. It obviously upset him that she's becoming emotionally attached to another man, but he didn't think it was anything more than an emotional attachment, you know. That's what he thought. So he kind of put a stop to it by moving her to live with a relative outside of San Francisco. and he thinks that's the end of it. So he does that. She's off living with a relative. Their baby's born, I believe, when she's away. And then Harry Larkins got a job in Calistoga, California. Florado was born, I want to say April, but I don't remember exactly, of 1874. And then at some point, Edward's visiting his wife. He discovers some letters, I guess from Harry Larkins. But even more damning is a photograph, not of Flora, not of Harry, not of the two of them together, but of Florado. What is damning about this is that in Flora's handwriting on the back of the photo is the name Harry. Some reports say it said Little Harry, implying she was going to send this photograph to Harry because she thought, at least, that Florado was not Edward's son, but Harry's. And apparently also, I think some of the letters that he found were actually provided by Flora's nurse. So Edward flies into a rage. So this is October of 1874, just a few months after their son is born. Edward decides he's going to take care of this problem. And I'm going to read to you an excerpt from a newspaper of the time, exactly how Edward took care of this problem. So let me just find it. This was the Russian River Flag, Volume 6, Number 50, October 22nd, 1874. The events of this paper occurred 5 days prior, on October 17th. On Saturday morning, Eadweard Muybridge was put in possession of some letters which convinced him that his wife and Larkins had been too well acquainted with each other. He raved around like a maniac until the boat started for Tallejo, when he took passage and went in search of the gay major. He reached the residence of Mr. Stewart at about 11 o'clock at night. The major, who was stopping there for the night on his way from Pine Flat to Calistoga, was in the parlor with a number of ladies and gentlemen playing a social game of cards. Muybridge knocked and was invited to enter. He replied, "I want to see Major Larkins." He was told that the major was inside and again invited to come in. "I will detain him only a moment," answered Muybridge. The major then arose, excused himself jocularly, and said, "I will go and find out where the mysterious voice comes from." He opened the door and looked out into the dark, but seeing no one, he asked, "Where are you, sir? I cannot see you." Then stepping further out, he asked, "Who are you?" Immediately the persons in the house heard a voice say, "My name is Muybridge. There is the answer to the letter you sent my wife." Then came the report of a pistol. Larkins clapped one hand to his breast and staggered through the hall, exclaiming, "Let me out! Let me out!" He opened a door at the other end and fell dead outside. Muybridge followed him with his pistol presented when Mr. MacArthur rushed out of the parlor and arrested him, though he attempted to shoot MacArthur. Several excited men proposed lynching the murderer, but Mr. Stewart vetoed the measure, and he was taken to the Napa jail. The major's body was sent to San Francisco and deposited temporarily in the Masonic vault to await orders from his friends in England. The funeral exercises were attended by many who had become warmly attached to Major Larkins during his life, which, notwithstanding his frailties, had shown many generous and redeeming qualities. He was a man of good family and breeding, considerable culture, and varied talent. He served 6 years in the British Army in India and was a staff officer with the rank of major in the French Army during the late Franco-Prussian War. His career in San Francisco began nearly 2 years ago. A young Englishman with whom he came to this state and who was his companion in fast living brought him into discreditable notoriety by having him arrested on a charge of obtaining money of him on false pretenses. This matter was settled by Larkins giving a draft on a relative in England for $4,000, which, if you remember the settlement from Muybridge with the Stagecoach Company, would be worth about $150,000 that he owed this person. Can you imagine owing someone $150,000? Seems like a lot. To reimburse him for half the money he had advanced for their mutual expenses. After this, Larkins proposed to redeem himself by a steady and industrious life. Since then, he has been variously employed: translator for a work published by Bancroft and Company, dramatic critic for The Post, writing theatrical plays, etc. At the time of his death, he was engaged in making a map of the Quicksilver region of Sonoma, Napa, and Lake counties, and had got it nearly ready for publication. His murderer will, of course, plead insanity on his trial, and, of course, be turned loose instead of being sent to the insane asylum. Let's see how that plays out, shall we? He was arrested and sent to the Napa jail, supposedly behaving himself quite nicely, but showed zero remorse for his actions. His trial absolutely hinged on this idea that he was not mentally responsible for his actions. An argument which was backed up by acquaintances who talked about how much he had changed since the accident. His head trauma made him crazy, so he was not responsible. Now, Muybridge, apparently determined to sabotage his freedom, argued truthfully that the murder was deliberate and premeditated. But he also helped himself, somewhat unintentionally, by having outbursts all during the trial. So, you know, he seemed a little crazy. As the Russian River flag had initially predicted, he was indeed acquitted on the grounds of justifiable homicide. I'm going to blend my giant forehead right now. The jury's reasoning was that they may not have been in accordance with written law, but they were in accordance with the law of human nature, meaning that they could not condemn a man for actions that they themselves would have done under the same circumstances. That looks terrible. It looks better in person, I promise. I don't suck at blending this bad. I have a lot of forehead, okay? It's just there. I do not have a receding hairline. This is just how my forehead is. If my hairline recedes, I don't know what I'm gonna do, okay? I'm gonna have all forehead and nothing else. I'm just gonna be forehead. Okay, so that's a sad thought. So he was indeed acquitted, just like that newspaper had predicted. I get it, you get a little crazy. That's why in murder cases, they always look at like the spouse or whatever. There's only so much I can do about this forehead. For real. Justifiable homicide, yay! He got out. Oh, but you know, the attention wasn't something he was crazy about. He liked attention. I think he liked being famous for his photography, but not so much murder. And I think his acquittal kind of made people angry. So he decided he was going to ditch to South America on a photographic expedition for a year. Now, the trial had begun in February of 1875, and once he was acquitted, he took off for South America. It was a different time, and you gotta judge people by the time, But, you know, it's just kind of one of those things that doesn't exactly age well, and so I have to laugh a little bit, okay? Just bear with me here. When he was in Guatemala, he was advertising his services and works under the name, get this, Eduardo Santiago Muybridge. Okay. Okay. Do that, sure. Back on the trial, it is still studied a little bit today because of the successful arguing the insanity plea, essentially. It was speculated by the late Arthur P. Shimamura, who was a psychologist at UC Berkeley and I believe passed away just last year, that Muybridge had likely suffered substantial injuries to the orbital frontal cortex and also possibly reaching into the anterior temporal lobes, which may have contributed to his emotional and eccentric behavior, but also, Shimamura claims or suggests, may have freed his creative mind from conventional social inhibitions. Little sidebar about Flora. During the trial, she filed for divorce, and the first time she filed for divorce, it was denied. She had cited abuse, but it was still denied. But she filed the second time, and the second time she was granted her divorce, but she very soon after fell ill, and I didn't see what she had, but she knew she was badly off. And because of this, she sent Florado to an orphanage. And she did indeed pass away in July of 1875, just a few months after securing her divorce. Because Edward did not believe Florado to be his own child, he didn't have anything to do with him afterward, but he did move him from the Catholic orphanage to a Protestant one. I assume he was not Catholic and kind of wanted, like, post-mortem stick it to Flora a little bit by moving him to a different type of orphanage. At the same time, if he was very religious, which I didn't see any indication of, but if he was, I guess I could understand wanting to do that. I'm not getting any further into religion, but that is what he did, and he did provide financially for Florado during Florado's adolescence, but he didn't have anything else to do with him because he believed him not to be his son. Now, the sad irony of that, Florado, or Flotty, as he had eventually come to be known by friends, supposedly in pictures in his adulthood did actually quite closely resemble Edward, and so may very well have been, I mean, just because Flora thought that he may have been Harry's child doesn't mean that was actually the case. They didn't have DNA testing at the time, and obviously her and Edward were together enough that Edward thought before finding the photograph that it was his child, so there's really no way to tell. And infuriatingly for me, I could not find any pictures that were really good for comparison to the photographs of Edward. I couldn't find any photographs of Harry Larkins either to compare them. There's only so much you can assume from somebody's appearance. And then just a little bit more about Flotty. He did claim through his life to be Edward's son, so much so that it's on his tombstone that he is the son of Eadweard Muybridge. He became a ranch hand, I believe, and then in 1944 in Sacramento he was struck by a car and killed, which is just so horribly sad. I don't really know what the middle part of his life was like, but a sad ending and a sad beginning. Alright, so back to ya boy Edward. Sometime around 1877, 1876, Edward returns from his South American photographic expedition, parading around as Eduardo. He returns and starts back to work with Leland Stanford at attempting to capture a horse at full speed, and not just, you know, a little fuzzy picture, but an actual good one. It is 1877 and he is back at the ranch, Stanford's property at the Palo Alto farm. He's working on it. He's gonna get this picture, gosh darn it. And he does get an actually pretty good photograph of, I'm not sure which horse at this point. It was still a little bit fuzzy. So what he did, which ended up being kind of a bad idea, was they had a retouch artist recreate the photo for a slightly better quality. Because the whole purpose was so that Leland Stanford could have this photograph framed nicely on his mantle or something. So they did have it recreated. Critics said that it was too heavily manipulated to be an accurate portrayal of a horse at full gallop. It didn't look like all the paintings where their hooves are like meh. So can't be right. Anyway, this did not actually bother Stanford or Muybridge very much, because they had another idea that they were going to attempt the following year. So in all this time that Muybridge had been doing all of these massive government-funded photography projects, he was improving the art of photography. He was developing ways to trigger a shutter. So what would happen is you'd have the shutter, and it was just that board that you'd like slam down in front of the camera to stop the exposure, which is the light, you know, exposing to light, that's what it is. So you'd have to have the photo exposed for a certain amount of time, so he's developing these things as he's traipsing around the entire world, basically, this famous photographer. And these were extremely important developments. So what he was doing was coming up with a way to pull a string or whatever in order to drop the shutter without it taking forever. And this was a crucial development for his next attempt at capturing the horse. June 1878, at the Palo Alto Stock Farm, which is now the Stanford University campus, Eadweard rigs a line of 12 cameras, and the shutters are going to be triggered by a tripwire, one by one, in succession, when the horse runs through. So there were two horses. There was Sally Gardner, that was ridden by a jockey, just normal horseback. And then there was Abe Edgington. Abe Edgington was driven by, I guess you'd still call him a jockey, but in a sulky, which is a two-wheel cart with basically just a seat. And you can still see sulky racing today. It's still a thing. And I actually own one. It's my husband's really, but whatever. So, they've had all these critics that don't think they can do this, that think it's not accurate. Horses don't look like that running, gosh darn it. They look like weird rabbit things or something. So they invited a bunch of the press to watch, and what really cinched it for Eadweard was when Sally Gardner, the horse that was being ridden horseback, ran through, a strap on her saddle broke during the process. So everybody sees this happen, and he developed the pictures right there. The series of 12 pictures, he developed them right on the spot so everybody could see, and the strap was captured on the negatives, so nobody could say that it was manipulated. It was right there. They saw the entire process, start to finish, the run, the photos being taken, the photos being developed, They saw the whole process firsthand, and this triumph was reported worldwide. This was essentially the first stop-motion photography, because he goes further, Eadweard. He does that. He goes further. He quieted the critics. He is famous yet again, or just more famous. Infamous. So the next thing that Eadweard does is he makes a projector specifically for this called a Zoopraxis Scope. You have these discs, and with Eadweard's they were glass discs. He started with 16 inches, and what he would do is he would have an artist copy with paint onto the glass discs each image from the photograph radially around the edge of the disc. So you'd have picture, 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 picture all the way around. Anyway, you didn't need that illustration. You're smart, you get this, okay. And so he would put it in the Zoopraxis Scope and he would crank it by hand, and it was a projector, so the, you know, mirrors and lights and such. So it would project onto a screen and the disc would turn. So it would make it look like a moving picture. He created a moving picture. Now, I sort of hate this comparison because it seems dismissive, but the easiest way for modern audiences to understand this concept is to compare it to a GIF. It's a continual loop or GIF, if you're one of those people. You're wrong though, because I know the inventor of them says it's GIF, but he's also wrong. I don't care that he's the inventor of it, because graphic interface, graphic, okay, GIF. Get it together, people. This is how phonics works. So that's cool in and of itself. We've got the first stop motion picture essentially, but it was also really cool in a scientific way because no one had ever seen what horses' legs actually, what was the actual motion? How do horses actually move their legs when they're running full speed? I need to stop saying actually. Because of the revelatory quality of Eadweard's picture, The Horse in Motion, well, pictures, the University of Pennsylvania sponsored him to photographically document the locomotion of human models, and also he went to the Philadelphia Zoo to photograph animals in motion. The models were very often nude or occasionally in bodysuits or just skin-colored underwear. Between 1883 and 1886, Eadweard produced more than 100,000 images for the University of Pennsylvania. In 1887, the photos were compiled in a collotype portfolio. The photos of the human models were usually like some sort of athletic endeavor, people boxing, doing long jumps. There's pictures of women hopping. It's a little weird, not gonna lie. But he was obsessed with locomotion. 20,000 of the photos in 1887 were compiled in the collection Animal Locomotion, an Electrophotographic Investigation of Connective Phases of Animal Movements. And Muybridge's work with the University of Pennsylvania has contributed to the study of biomechanics, athletics, and photography, and also, you know, his trial with psychology. So he's all over the place. He's influenced a lot of things. Interesting person. But his work at the university is still referenced by artists, animators, and students today. Of the many thousands of images that Muybridge created while working with the University of Pennsylvania, almost said Philadelphia, but yeah, you know, were recreated on 740 or 81 Zoopraxis Scope discs that he would travel around himself and lecture with on the locomotion of humans and animals. His work was also presented by himself at the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 as a series of lectures called The Science of Animal Locomotion in the Zoopraxisgraphical Hall, where he used his Zoopraxis Scope to display his moving pictures to a paying public, making the Zoopraxisgraphical Hall the very first movie theater, essentially. In 1894, Edward returned to England, and he continued to lecture and publish works on collections of his pictures and about animal locomotion, of course, since this had basically become his life's obsession, up to his death on May 8th of 1904 in his cousin's home. He died of prostate cancer. He was cremated and his ashes were interred at Woking in Surrey. I'm not really sure what Woking is, but that's where his ashes are. Now in 1882, that would be my dog Rocky freaking out at probably a raccoon. For reference, it's actually 2 in the morning. Inspired by the spelling of names of Anglo-Saxon figures, Edward changed the spelling of his first name to Eadweard. And I believe I mentioned his last name was also frequently misspelled Muybridge instead of Muybridge. And I think it was just a little bit of poetic justice for some of his shady behavior through life that on his headstone his name was spelled, his first name was spelled correctly, Eadweard, the way he had changed it in 1882, but his last name is spelled, for posterity, till the end of time, Muybridge. Now, odd of a dude as he was, he made incredibly important contributions to photography, cinematography, biomechanics, physiology, that sort of thing, psychology, kind of inadvertently. In 1882, Etienne Jules Murray recorded the first series of live-action photos with a single camera. So essentially what Muybridge had done with this series of cameras, this person had done with one camera in 1882. Just a handful of years after his triumph with the horse in motion. And then in 1890, William Dixon was inspired to invent the first recognized motion picture camera. And then in 1891, Thomas Edison came along and used the discoveries of Muybridge and the Lumiere brothers to develop his own motion picture cameras, which used a higher frame rate and continuous motion. And then Thomas Edison secured patents for these things. Of course he did. Much later, using the principles of Muybridge's stop motion work, John Gaeta, I think that's how you pronounce his name, Gaeta, created the technique that we know as bullet time for the 1999 film The Matrix, of course. Now, essentially, the principle behind that was that instead of it being that you're speeding up motion by taking singular pictures, you're slowing it down. Gee, 1999. That's over 20 years ago. I remember when The Matrix came out. That makes it sound like I'm ancient or something, and I'm really not. Don't come at me, people, okay? I'm gonna be 30 this year. I keep finding white hairs. I'm old enough. Okay. I'm gonna put these lashes on so that I can take them off in 5 minutes when I go back in my house. And I suck at putting lashes on, but we're gonna try. Don't come at me for this either, okay? I just said I suck at it, so I know my limitations. Ooh. Oh, but they are So cute. These are really chill fake lashes. Also, if you're interested in some fun reading, I assume fun reading, that's what all the reviews said about Harry Larkins, you know, the guy he murdered. There is a book, a supposedly extremely well-researched one about it called The Scoundrel Harry Larkins. I believe some of the information was from the sister of Harry Larkins. Alright, lashes are on. And they're coming off in 5 minutes. Probably. Okay, I think this is cute. What do you think? That's it. That's all I've got for you. So I'm gonna peace out of here because that is the story of Eadweard Muybridge, his contributions to a lot of things, and a little bit of why he is important to cinematography, because he essentially started it. He started it, and not for the sake of it itself, but just because he was so hyper-focused with locomotion and capturing it on camera. It had been almost a decade-long endeavor for him to get that successful picture of the horse, and once he did, there was no stopping him. I hope you have a wonderful day whenever it is that I get this up on YouTube. Bye! He was sort of so he couldn't drink with alcohol. Photographic. And because Eadweard, oh my word, this stupid hair will come off my face. To post, I'm Canadian now, in a row. I said a line, oh my word. A line of them, they're in a line. Okay, we know what a line is. Woo.